Hello and welcome to Sounds Strategic, the podcast of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I am Antonio Sampaio. So today we're picking the brains of three experts on the issue of policing. The killing of George Floyd, a black man, earlier this year in the United States, sparked a widespread debate about police conduct and relations with marginalized communities. And this is a debate that several developing countries know all too well. And our aim today is to explore the international challenges and lessons on policing violent cities. Our guests have conducted research in Brazil, Kenya, Somalia, and other settings. So I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Ignacio Cano, member of the Laboratory for the Analysis of Violence at the Rio de Janeiro State University in Brazil. He's currently a visiting researcher at the Safety Lab in Cape Town. I'm also joined by Dr. Alice Hills, visiting professor at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom and author of several books on policing and security in cities. And also with us is Dr. Tessa Diphoorn, assistant professor at the Department of Cultural Anthropology at Utrecht University, where she currently conducts a research project on policing in Kenya. So, if I may, I will start west and make our way east. Ignacio, I often see Rio de Janeiro as a case study in military documents, even about urban warfare, reflecting the frequent armed clashes fought between drug trafficking groups and the military police there. So, why has policing Rio become so violent, even more so than most other cities in Brazil and even Latin America?
The whole security paradigm in Brazil, in particular in cities like Rio de Janeiro, is a military paradigm. It's not just the police. The whole strategy, the dynamics, the tactics, everything is militarized. And because it is conceived as a war between criminal groups and against criminal groups, then police has become a kind of military organization with huge firepower, bulletproof vehicles, bulletproof helicopters, helicopters attacking from the air. So it's a whole scenario of an Afghanistan or a Vietnam movie that you can see in Rio de Janeiro, and it's considered normal because the problem is seen as a military problem to start with.
Tessa, I recently visited Nairobi, and some of the problems voiced by slum communities there regarding police abuse sound similar to what I've observed in Rio and what Ignacio was describing, this idea of the police being seen as brutal and abusive. How have the police approached security in Nairobi's famously sprawling slums? I mean, the city has some of the largest slums in Africa.
Well, thanks. That's a very good question. I mean, I think for many police officers working in Nairobi, many of the slum areas or ghettos or informal settlements or whatever title you'd like to give them are seen as kind of the breeding ground for what they refer to as thugs. And this concept of the thug is a very problematic one because it's something that's also used in the media discourse and created as this kind of the idea of the urban enemy that needs to be tackled. So what you'll see a lot of times is that young men are killed by police officers and then are framed as a thug. And this also raises a lot of support among many Kenyans as well, that this kind of killing was justified because, in this way, crime is being prevented, etc. So I think that this is one of the ways that the police particularly frame this as an urban crime problem, and that this in a way kind of justifies a lot of the extrajudicial killings that happen in many of Nairobi slums. Is of course very problematic. But at the end of the day, in many of my interviews with police officers, and many of them don't like working in a lot of these areas as well. So it's also for them a very problematic experience too. And I think many police officers would prefer to work in more upper class or middle class neighborhoods as well. So there's a different perspective to that as well.
Alice, you have examined the issue of policing in Mogadishu, which of course is a city with a very different context than Nairobi or Rio, where the problems we are discussing are amplified by the utter weakness of the Somali state. What are some of the challenges in building a police institution and in actually policing day-to-day cities like Mogadishu, located in what we call fragile states, or states affected by conflict and very with weak institutions?
I think the example of Somalia and Mogadishu in particular is extreme. That in a way is quite helpful because it separates it from Nairobi or indeed Latin America. So it lets us look at what you might call the fundamentals of policing. And that's actually important because one of the things that's very striking is that we're expected to look at form of policing in a society in which state and police institutions are simply a facade. If you look at Mogadishu, it looks as though, and certainly from the media, it looks as though there is a police force. There are police buildings, there are police officers doing police business. In practice, it's a lot more ambiguous and fluid and also violent than that suggests. So I think perhaps the initial problem for certainly international commentators is to decide quite what it is this phenomenon of police is.
Tessa, we have seen some reports from Kenya about yet more abusive behavior against slum dwellers during the implementation of the curfews and lockdowns during the COVID pandemic. Has the pandemic made things worse in terms of police-community relations, violence, and all of that?
Yes. Well, I guess if you would ask this question to a lot of the community members of some of these neighborhoods, I think they would definitely say that the situation has gotten worse since the pandemic. And I think what we see in Nairobi and perhaps in many other countries and in other parts of Kenya as well is that the COVID-19 and kind of the regulations towards the pandemic have been highly securitized. So it's become, rather than a health hazard, it's become a bit of it's framed very much as a security problem. And the National Police Service of Kenya have been given a very prominent role in kind of maintaining the curfew. And this is, of course, very interesting that the police is largely responsible for kind of maintaining these regulations, and that the Public Order Act has also been included in order to enforce these regulations. So, I mean, the police have been given kind of more power in a way to enforce the regulations. And this is unquestionably, worsened already very fragile relationship between community members and police officers in many parts of the city, definitely.
Mm. And Ignacio, violence in Rio has reached such a ghastly point that a court, I believe, had to order a halt in police operations in Rio's favelas during the pandemic, ordering them not to conduct any operations in the favelas out of fear that it would cause, more deaths. Why did the courts have to interfere, and has this changed anything in terms of police violence in slums?
Yes, well, the court interference has two parts. One is specific to the pandemic, and then there's a more general part about how police conduct operations in the slums. So as far as the pandemic goes, the argument was that police operations, customary police operations in the slums, were causing a lot of insecurity, of course, and they were even disrupting assistance efforts towards these communities because of COVID. So people had to stay at home. Aid was being delivered and the police arrived. There was a shootout. People who were giving the aid had to take cover, and the aid assistance had to be interrupted. So the first part of the intervention was there should not be police operations in the slums, in the favelas, as long as we have the pandemic, so that the other types of assistance can be delivered. And that was granted by the court. And the police in Rio was forbidden from carrying out police operations in the slum, except in exceptional circumstances that had to be justified. Now, the problem is, of course, the Supreme Court did not specify what exceptional circumstances mean. And there was a lot of leeway to interpret that. Beyond that, there was a sharp reduction in police violence. There was a reduction in terms of 70% in the number of people killed in police operations in Rio after this court order. And there was not an explosion in other crimes or in homicides. So that was very instrumental in showing that the narrative of the government that we need to kill these people, otherwise the security situation is going to go out of control, was plainly not true, because police operations reduced significantly, and still the general safety operation did not change very much in the city. That was the first part. The second part is a deeper challenge to how police conduct these operations in general, and it goes beyond the pandemic. And the court Supreme Court is still voting on that, but there is already a majority in the direction of imposing limits. For example, you have to have an ambulance, you can't do it close to schools or hospitals, and things like that. We have also questioned a lot the use of these helicopters in attack operations. We once questioned one of these operations a few years back, and I remember the pilot of the operation telling us that he was very proud that only in Afghanistan did they have, in that case it was the US Army, helicopters that were able to carry such operations as they did in Rio. And he was plainly very proud of that. So that challenge is still going on, and we have a high hope that if it finally prevails, we will be able to introduce some limit to the damage that these operations cause. Of course, this is on the other hand an invasion of executive power, because it's the courts setting up a lot of limits as to how the executive power should conduct its business. And because it's very technical, then the courts, of course, as I said before, did not explain what exceptional circumstances would be that would justify such operations under the pandemic. So it's a very abnormal situation, but the way that the executive has conducted these operations is so extreme that the courts finally have intervened and tried to put some limits to that. Ultimately, I think, Antonio, what we have is a crisis of the legitimacy of the rule of law, because unfortunately many people in Brazil voted for governments, both at the federal and the state level, that support exactly these kind of operations, and then regardless of what the law says. So I think that beyond the technical issues or the legal issues, we have a much wider social legitimacy issue about how police should conduct themselves.
Mm. Yeah, and unfortunately, that's another area of where Brazil has some cautionary tales for the rest of the world, since it's not, unfortunately, limited to Brazil. Alice, Somalia faces COVID challenges like all other countries, basically, in the world, but it also fights against the insurgent group Al-Shabaab. How has law enforcement there balanced the challenges of this war fighting with those of day-to-day urban policing? And I'm not sure if you have any information on how COVID might have sort of compounded this challenge.
A brief comment about COVID to start off with then. I'm not sure what effect it's had, and I'm not sure anybody really knows. It will have affected police as much as residents, but bear in mind that actually health provision, in quotes, in Somalia, even in the centre of Mogadishu, is minimal at best. If you go outside Mogadishu, then it's just one of many other issues. Acute watery diarrhea, measles, respiratory diseases, you name it. It's just something else in amongst the mix. The balance between Al-Shabaab and health-related issues, I don't think it's been fundamentally upset actually, or changed. I'd be very surprised if it has, because Al-Shabaab and the security issues associated with it, which are quite a broad range of issues actually, dominates. Certainly in meetings in which police, higher-ranking or mid-ranking police are present, it dominates all concerns, particularly at the moment with so many assassinations and other attempted fatalities. I haven't seen any public open access work on the balance, but certainly from conversations I've sat in on the past, I doubt very much if COVID is having that much of an impact. Not on decision-making anyway.
What about, Alice, if I may ask a follow-up, more broadly, the way that the embryonic, let's say, still weak Somali state has balanced the need to have a police force that deals with issues such as terrorism and insurgency, potentially preventing Al-Shabaab terrorist attacks in Mogadishu, and how has that impacted, I believe it has, but impacted the sort of legitimacy and the way that it interacts with the population, sort of this dilemma between being a war-fighting force or a law enforcement force?
Okay, yes, but do bear in mind that in most parts of Somalia, including Mogadishu, police are effectively almost militia, if not actually overtly militia. If I can just give you an extreme example from further south, in Kismayo last year, there were some 600 police and 5,000 militiamen. And also the functional divisions between the two are ambiguous, fluid, all those kind of words. So it's not actually as clear-cut a situation as perhaps some commentators might expect.
Ignacio, if I may return to you, Rio has grappled with extreme forms of police violence for decades now. I think we can go back to at least the 1980s when the transnational cocaine industry became really a multi-billion-dollar source of income. Is there any potential light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, are there any lessons that we can learn? Are there any positive experiments or experiences in Rio that have improved, even if momentarily, the situation there that we can share potentially with other cities and countries?
We've had a few attempts at community policing, mostly localized, which had a reasonable impact, although they were discontinued. And then we had the famous experiments of the pacifying police units for a few years, which reduced homicide rates in these areas by 50%. So in that respect, and they reduced police violence even more than 50%. So they were, say, successful in the beginning, but their success was diminishing over time, and they ended up being discontinued. I think at least they leave a very important legacy, which is to show that this militarized sort of combat against crime is not the only way to deal with violence and insecurity in the slums. So in the future, despite the final, say, failure of the model, it will be remembered as an alternative that worked for some time. So I think that is very important. In the short term, I don't think there are many hopes because, as I said, the political projects that took over both in Rio and in Brasilia as a whole are political projects based explicitly in exterminating alleged criminals. Now, today, this very same day, the governor of Rio has been suspended by the courts. And that's an important development because something that people forget is that there is a close connection between corruption and police violence. So a significant part of police violence is associated with corruption. Drug dealers will be killed so that the next drug dealers know they have to pay up to a certain threshold, and otherwise they will be killed. And there is also a link between corruption and violence at a higher political level. So many of these candidates, like the governor of Rio today, who has been suspended because of corruption charges linked to the pandemic, fraud related to the emergency tenders that were provided because of COVID. Again, at the higher political level, there is also a connection. And these candidates that come to save the country and kill all the criminals oftentimes really want to benefit personally through these positions. And I think if that is confirmed, which seems very likely, it may work to delegitimize at least these candidates that promise social cleansing and then actually really want to be rich like most other people. The same, to a lesser degree, applies to the Bolsonaro family, some of whose members are being investigated for some kind of fraud linked to public funding in the state assembly. And again, if this comes to the end and there are some sentences, it will come to prove once again that these broad speeches about social cleansing and eliminating bandits are just one more way to capitalize on people's anger and to become rich on the backside. So I think the hopes for the future in Rio and in Brazil as a whole depend on bringing down this political project of extermination of criminals and building again some kind of civilized rule of law model, not just for policing, but for the country as a whole.
If we may stay on the theme of corruption, which is very important indeed, Ignacio, just a follow-up. Brazil, as you mentioned, has long and dark history of contact with corruption and political corruption. We had the big car wash investigation that uncovered billions and billions of dollars worth in corruption from state-controlled enterprises. Has this anti-corruption sort of ethos that has been so popular in Brazil in recent years, has it had any positive impact in terms of police? And more concretely, has the police improved in any way or had any positive experiences with anti-corruption and sort of correction units within the police to sort of tackle these issues?
There's no improvement in police internal affairs units, for example, or anything like that, because this drive against corruption was targeted at very high political and economic groups, and it was also very biased, oriented towards the left. So now there is a fracture between these groups, and it's very apparent that many of those prosecutors and judges were targeting the corruption in the left, in the PT, basically. But I mean, as far as life on the ground and in the slums, for example, this is pretty much irrelevant, because most of policing, everyday policing, is targeted at the slums, poor areas. And what happens at the high level is completely irrelevant. So it's not going to have an impact on policing as a whole. It will have a very strong impact on politics in the country. And we are still to see what the final outcome of all of it will be.
Yeah. Tessa, the issue of corruption is yet another sort of parallel that I've seen between what happens in Brazil and in Kenya, especially in terms of urban policing. Can you talk to us a little bit about the issues that Kenyan police, and especially in Nairobi, have had with corruption and sort of bribery? Is there the same type of sort of gang police relationship working there? And again, the same question to you: are there any positive examples in terms of anti-corruption? Any improvements that we can look forward to?
Well, yeah. I mean, I definitely agree that corruption is also a very big problem in Kenya. But I would also argue that it's not necessarily a police problem. But that corruption can be found, although the state police is seen as maybe the most corrupt state organization. I mean, we see corruption occurring with almost all state organs, for example. And so it's not necessarily only a police issue, but of course, in terms of everyday interactions between police officers and citizens, this is definitely a fundamental problem. And what I think that it's so ingrained within the organizational culture of the police. I mean, it starts from the moment that police officers enter the force. I mean, very often they pay to become a police officer. And where does this money come from? Very often this is something that maybe is kind of found together. They kind of lend money from somebody, or they gather money from relatives, and then they are indebted to them in some way. And there was an entire vetting process of the Kenyan police that's been going on for a while. And you could just see these trails of money going from lower ranking police officers to higher ranking police officers. So it's a very big problem that has tried to be addressed through a range of programs. But I think if you would ask any Kenyan citizen, I don't think that they've seen a decrease in the amount of corruption. And I think that everyday bribes and these kinds of things are still something that many Kenyan citizens face. On the other hand, I do think maybe this is moving a little bit away from corruption generally, but more what has been going on with the police. I mean, in Kenya, we've seen a very extensive police reform trajectory. And I mean, Alice has also written about this as well. And there have been a lot of initiatives to transform the Kenyan police. And although I concur with many of the critics that a lot of these initiatives have not really achieved what they set out to do, I also think that there have been some improvements. And I think even the most critical Kenyan citizen would argue that there have been some changes. Police stations are more accessible, and there have been changes. And I think maybe if there's time, I could just mention three really briefly. One of the things that there's been a lot of focus on police oversight. So through an internal affairs unit, as Ignacio also mentioned in Rio, but also through the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, IPOA, which is an external organization. And I do think that the establishment of these oversight bodies has had a tremendous impact. Again, there's been a lot of criticism against these organizations for not really setting out to do what they had to do, and for not investigating properly, for not dealing with the amount of cases that they have been supposed to raise. But I do think that due to their investigations, Several police officers have been found guilty of murder, for example. And I do think that police officers know that there is an organization watching them to a certain extent. So it's maybe minimal change and a lot more needs to be done. But the mere fact that these organizations exist, I do think does point to a certain direction and potentiality for further change. I think another thing, what we've also seen, particularly the last few years, is the strengthening of civil society. So in many of Nairobi's urban settlements, we've seen the establishment of social justice centers that are documenting police violence and that are protesting against police violence. And this was much less 10, 15 years ago, for example. So I think that there's been a much stronger civil society and really people that are really standing up and saying, enough is enough of these extrajudicial killings. Unfortunately, the police violence isn't decreasing, but hopefully by the further strengthening of the civil society, there's again potentiality for change. And I think even just this space for potentiality is something to look at. And maybe a third issue, and this is maybe related to corruption as well, within the police, a lot of focus has also been placed on police leadership and kind of seeking out, for lack of a better word, good police officers, whatever that may be, but police officers that really want to that want the police force to change and that really want to bring a different idea of policing and investing in these police officers and providing them with education and somehow getting them in more leadership roles. And I think that this is key, that eventually we need people in leadership, people at the top that really want change, because as long as those at the top are not going to encourage police officers for change, a lot of the efforts will kind of will disappear or will just go unnoticed. So these are maybe 3 lessons that we could take from the Kenyan case.
Sure, thank you, Alice. In terms of still in the theme of corruption, but of course in Somalia it has a particular color and a particular format that is different from more sort of developed, economically developed countries. The issue of militias that you've mentioned, that police forces are sometimes comprised of militias instead of police officers, is one that I also heard when I was there. So this idea that many of the officers will not, their allegiance and their workings will not be aligned exactly with the state or the government's sort of policies and priorities, but rather with sort of clans and their personal patrons. This perhaps can be interpreted as a form of corruption, but it's certainly a corruption of the public role of the police. Do you see any ways that the Somali state has or could sort of tackle this fragmentation of the police force into militias?
The honest answer is that I don't believe the Somali state, in quotes, has any interest whatsoever. It doesn't have any credibility. It doesn't have the capacity. It doesn't have the desire to do anything about this because it's so involved. It's part of the fundamentals of the social context, if you like, the environment. And that, as Transparency International will tell you only too clearly, is in our terms deeply, deeply corrupt. I think many people at all levels of society recognize this, though tends to be put to one side because they're too busy trying to live, find food, etc., etc. Is there a will to do much about it? I don't really think so. Yes, there are some individuals some police officers, mid-ranking, education and so on, who want to do something, who would like to change things, they say, but it's very difficult to know what their agenda is, how their agenda is meshes with that of donors, for example, who push this particular line. Increasingly, though, it's also part of the possibly subsidiary to the equality agenda. I just don't see very much changing. It operates at every single level of society. I just don't see any will to do anything about it, not least because politicians are doing too nicely. I mean, actually, only today and yesterday and earlier this week, there were several cases reported of senior politicians losing their job and being imprisoned for corruption. It's great, I suppose you could argue that that's been taken forward, but does it really amount to very much? Is it any more than a gesture? Possibly a gesture to appease donors. It's difficult to tell. I'd be surprised if it marks a fundamental shift in the general approach. But basic lesson is the Somali state, in quotes, because that's what it is, a facade, has no desire, no capacity, no genuine will to change anything. It's doing too nicely out of the current situation.
Is this state building effort or the aid that has been for some time, many years, being given by donors to Somalia to build and improve institutions. Has it had any positive impact on security is very bad in Somalia, of course, but if we look more narrowly at the issue of policing or security in Mogadishu, for instance, has it had an impact, perhaps improved somehow this dynamics that we're discussing?
Yes, there have been some, I think, quite impressive projects, small-scale projects in districts that, for a while at least, really did seem to improve police-community relations, seem to improve what you might call public safety in small areas. Whether they last, whether they actually make a fundamental difference once people shift, die, move, or whatever, is open to question. So at a very sort of micro level, I suppose you could say that donor money has made a difference, but it does tend to be, the difference does tend to be superficial, temporary. It's not fundamental. It doesn't make a major shift. It doesn't mark a major shift. So in many respects, as a British taxpayer, my money's been wasted. On the other hand, if it's made life better for a small district, if it's stopped some rather gross, egregious examples of brutality, corruption, and so forth, that may be as much as we can hope for. It sounds very dumb. I'm playing a bit of a wet blanket, I suppose, but it's about time, actually, we were slightly more realistic in what our expectations are.
Ignacio, if I may return to you on one issue from the Rio case that I've been particularly interested in recent years and for many years is the issue of the pacifying police units, the UPPs. And this is something that Tessa was also referring to, this idea of community policing and improving the accessibility to the police among the community. And in the case of Rio, unfortunately, the pacifying police units, the pacification program, as it was called, sort of has declined in both popularity and impact. I want to gather your views on why the pacifying police units have somewhat failed and lessons you see for how efforts to improve community relations could be sustained, could be more sustainable in the long term, because it's an effort that costs money. So both for Rio and for other cities out there, or the large developing country cities, how can they sustain improvements in community policing, relationships between officers and the communities?
Well, before we get into that, Antonio, I would like to briefly refer to something that Tessa said before. I agree with her also in the Brazilian case that corruption is not just a police problem. It's a societal problem. It's a state problem. And the police officers will always tell you that. But in policing, it's particularly serious because police officers have a gun and the authority to use it. So it turns particularly problematic. Also, she was also referring to internal affairs and how it was expanded in the case of Kenya. In Rio, we're in the opposite situation because the first measure the governor took was to dissolve the Secretary of Public Security so that police forces are now accountable only to themselves and to the governor. There is not a single body to direct policies regarding to security or the police forces themselves. So it's very interesting how oversight is now going backwards in Brazil because of this political project. As far as the pacifying units and the pacification project is concerned, I think the major reason for failure was that it always remained an invasion project. So police would come into these slums and stay, which was good because it interrupted the shootouts between criminal groups and mainly the shootouts by police themselves when they entered the slum. So it stopped this invasion operation by the police in regular intervals because police stayed there. But then from there, they never built a more community police model. They called it was proximity policing, which is a similar model that was never developed, in fact. So the police mistrusted the community mistrusted the police. And the police are never, I think this is the main lesson that we could try to propose for other areas. You may call it community policing, but if the local police is not accountable to the local population, it will never work. and he was never accountable to the local population. We were hired as consultants during a certain phase by the government to propose changes. And one of the things we discussed among ourselves was, okay, there should be a vote, a secret vote in the community every few years, so that the community decides whether they want the police there or not. Now, this was complete anathema to most people. Like, how are we going to leave it to the hands of the community to decide whether they want police or not? Police has to be imposed. So there was never a way to make the police accountable to local communities. If you can get to that, which is a huge challenge, I know, it's nothing easy, then I think it may work. So that when police make a mistake, when they are rough to people, there is a way to take measures, and the community has a way to change that. If you don't give the community a way to change that, I think it will perpetuate itself. And now, as it was always the case in Rio, the community feels the police are there to protect other people from them. They never feel the police are there to protect them. And that's what we need to change.
Tessa, in the case of Kenya, as Ignacio was mentioning, the pacifying police units in Rio struggled for the entirety of the pacification program with this imbalance between policing and what we could call governance or development, the provision of public services infrastructure, that you can put as many police officers as you can in a certain area, but if you don't bring the rest of the public sector and the state into those marginalized areas, once the police leaves, the space will still be open for criminal groups and other illicit economies and actors. Have you seen an improvement not only in policing or a debate about improvements in development, in public services? Because, slum areas like Matari, like Kibera are extremely marginalized, and I've visited them, and even more than many favelas in Rio. Like, they're much, much bigger, and their needs in terms of sanitation, health, and public services are even more acute than those in many areas of Latin America. So has the state sort of opened its eyes to this need of development and governance in such areas?
Well, this is a bit of a difficult question, because I'll also be really honest that this is not really an area that I focus on, but a very good colleague of mine, she does do a lot of work about this as well, and also about how, I completely agree with you that in many of these areas, there's a general lack of public services, water, access to water, sanitation, electricity, basic needs for survival. And this is a fundamental problem. But one of the things that she's also uncovered in her work is that the police are also very often involved in, for example, evictions, or when water is cut off, the police are also involved in these processes. So that the police are not only involved in crime prevention or conducting investigations, but become involved in kind of acting as the authoritarian force of the state in much larger problems that are not really about crime and security in a way. And this is definitely a fundamental problem. And there's definitely a difference in this, because this is not the role that the police plays in the more middle class and upper class areas of Nairobi. So there's definitely a different role for police officers in these areas. And I think there's so many similarities between Nairobi and Rio, from what I'm hearing from Ignacio as well, because for a lot of it is many Mathare residents feel that the police is not there to protect them, but it's to protect other residents from them. So it's more, and it's about containment in a way, and about containing certain and maintaining certain class and ethnic and racial borders, and the police is very much a key player in this. And so, I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Thank you very much. I think that's all the time we have today. Thank you very much to all three speakers for very interesting discussion and very international discussion on policing, which I think is much needed in these times. And thank you to our listeners as well. And this week I add a personal note. This is my last episode as a co-host of Sounds Strategic. I will be leaving the Institute at the end of the month to other endeavors. But thank you very much for listening to me during this time. Sounds Strategic, of course, continues with May announcements. And thank you. And to keep up to date with the latest trends in international security and conflicts, follow the ISS on Twitter, Instagram, and other social media. So see you next time.